What is a cult? Not a question we tend to ask ourselves while world building. After all, we're all kind of on the same page. A cult is, well, a group of weird people who believe in something pretty strange and often exhibit some dangerous or unusual behaviours, right? Well, no. Turns out, among the community that studies religions, cult is a word almost never used. It means very nearly nothing and has a lot of baggage attached. I want to dive into that baggage to figure out why we're so obsessed with putting cults all over our fantasy worlds. This video will be discussing modern cults in some minor detail, as well as touching on brainwashing and deprogramming, just so you're aware. What we sometimes call a cult is often called a new religious movement in modern scholarship, and funnily enough, there are very few religious movements that don't start out as new religious movements, or NRMs. NRMs have a few key features that make them stand out. They go against established culture in some way. If they're part of an existing faith, that means challenging the established truth or practice. But if they're entirely new, this means challenging established norms or beliefs of wider society that they spring from. NRMs also often require a kind of strict social order among their members, often manifesting as some sort of communal living or of financial control, even down to arranging relationships and births around the group's goals. Finally, and most critically for our discussion today, there is a leader or a group of significant figures who have authority and charisma. They convince people to follow them, join their movement, and abide by their rules. That's the thing. In fantasy, we often see cults depicted as organizations devoted to some dread god or demon. But in reality, the movements most often described as cults have their physically present charismatic leader as an object of some great devotion. So where does Satan or Orcus come in all of this? Well, in doctrine, belief, and ritual, sure. But most NRMs do have also a goal. They want to be the best. They want to be saved, and they want to be right. They are hopeful movements, not built on some despairing resignation for the unknown dread lord they serve, but rather a hope-filled fervent belief that their doing things right will be vindicating, rewarding, or at least serve them in good stead when things come to a head. So, this is a group of like-minded people living under the imposed social order of a charismatic leader because they believe they know something or are doing something that others aren't. And here we are at the core of why I really dislike cults in games and why we're so very obsessed with them. Much of the modern fantasy industry, gaming and writing, exists from an American perspective. And from the 70s, American popular culture has been awash in a clash between new religious movements, NRMs, and anti-cult activists. From the Satanic Panic, which nearly killed D&D in its infancy, to the rise of beliefs in brainwashing and deprogramming, beliefs that members of these movements are somehow mentally reprogrammed by their charismatic leaders, the media scrutinizes new religious movements with a distinctive fervor. Of course, this is all in the background of some awful and tragic mass losses of life, often premeditated among some of these fringe groups. But the fact remains that essentially in the US, due to mass panic, concern and a media feeding frenzy around these awful and horrific worst case scenarios, cult is synonymous with some of the worst and most depraved examples of human coercive control, and due to the mainstreaming of Christianity in modern US culture, these are often perceived as acts of the devil, or at least thus influenced. It's no small wonder, then, that despite aesthetic influences from Aztecs, voodoo, Lovecraft, weird tales and other pulp magazines, a cult in modern fiction always seems to be in the process of summoning or worshipping some ancient evil that will ruin the world. It's often down to this quite binary Christian sense of good and evil, that anything that is aberrant is demonic, devilish, or summoning some dread, horrific entity. But what reasonable, or even verifiably mad person actually wants the summoning of an evil, malevolent entity that will destroy the world? New religious movements are, by their nature, hopeful. Followers believe that they and their small community have the right way of things, that at least they might be spared from the apocalypse, or have actually uncovered the secrets of how to live properly in the world. A cult religion must offer something to its new followers. The promise of a partner, closer relationships to God or the divine, enlightenment, or even salvation. Now, in a fantasy world, there are more tangible benefits on offer, magic being chief among them. If following a movement's practices allows one to see the future, or use magical powers you couldn't before, well, that's a pretty good reason to stick around in spite of the coercive control they may be exhibiting upon you. Resurrection, for example, is a wonderful boon in those worlds that use it, and in worlds where the heavens are in some way observable, or even with any idea of salvation, eternal bliss is a pretty good reward. But most fantasy cults end up dedicated to some niche deity, often, strangely, being the only worshippers of said deity, which is not really a cult, but a faith. A cult or new religious movement usually teaches something non-traditional about a god or faith system, not just worshipping a god like everyone else does, but it's just a weird and niche god. Or, if they're not dedicated to some strange entity, they're almost always seeking to bring about a dramatic event. Often an attempt to free their dread lord from its chains, probably to usher in some new cataclysm. In real life, we have many examples of new religious movements that feel like they can predict apocalypses. It's fewer that think that they can bring them about, and fewer still that think that they're going to be the sole survivors, on Earth at least, after the apocalypse happens. Our apocalyptic new religious movements are usually focused on preparing the body and the soul for the end times to come, before they need to either move the goalposts or disband when said end times fail to come. It makes sense that in a fantasy world with more imminent and active deities, these movements may have gods who interact with them much more directly. But if the god or object of worship isn't personally recruiting these followers and taking an active role, then it must in fact be a charismatic, regular enough person leading the cult. In this case, there can be no personal plea deals with the trapped entity, or tempting offers from beyond the veil. There is instead a charismatic head of the group who is responsible for keeping everyone on side, with or without their patron's whispering voice in everyone's ears, to achieve the group's goal. All this is to say, there's only really a couple of ways to go against the natural proclivity of people to want some reward for putting in work and making sacrifices. One, by telling them that they were born flawed and they need to fix that to make up to it, making it kind of an inverse reward system. And two, actual brainwashing. Sure, if your charismatic leader is actually just enchanting or manipulating their own followers, then any form of self-preservation or hope doesn't actually matter, nor does any form of a seemingly just reward. Coercive tactics such as negative reinforcement and separating people from trusted advisors, family, and friends also work, but not necessarily to cause someone to doom their eternal soul knowingly for absolutely no reward. So, essentially, minor mind-controlling magic may be a very useful tool in a potential cult leader's arsenal, but do be careful including such things in your games, partly because this is a live, active debate in modern communities about whether cult joiners are in some way being brainwashed, a process fixable by the implausible deprogramming. Both terms are fraught and filled with some very modern and fresh lived experiences, so make sure you check with your table or make clear with your audience that such things will be being addressed. So, we have our cult leader, who's a holder of some counter-cultural truth that they feel people need to observe. We have a group of followers who believe in this message, and we have an object of faith, either a new way of seeing an established God, or some new philosophy about how the world works, or the leader themselves. But our quote-unquote cult needs a goal. And most fantasy cult goals are terrible and uncreative. So let's borrow some more intriguing cultic goals from real life. Let's start with the common doomsday style. We've dealt broadly with the fact that prediction, purification and preparation are more common goals than bringing about the apocalypse yourselves. Perhaps a group anticipates a draconic war and stockpiles dragon-slaying equipment. Maybe a group kidnaps magical religious figures and imprisons them in order to fight off the upcoming predicted undead apocalypse. Perhaps they guard an object that they consider to be a gate to the heavens in preparation for the end times, resolutely certain that they need to defend this gate from the desperate and only allow in those who have passed their tests. These are all so much more interesting and novel than an attempt to summon the 17th eldritch horror that will inevitably eat them and everything else. Self-destructive NRMs also loom large in media presentations, as their disbandings are often quite dramatic. Such cults often have a purpose of sorts, usually related to an established concept in a broader faith taken to the extreme. Destruction is often seen as holy, perhaps a response to an expected apocalypse, or some last-ditch effort to offer something to the divine object of worship. These groups almost never self-destruct in a vacuum, though. Scrutiny from authorities, unpaid debts, spiraling personal situations, or feelings of irrelevance can all act as motivating factors in these most horrific of situations. For these groups, perhaps the pressure felt by a kingdom's investigators or a faith's investigators, or simply the intrepid adventurers getting closer to their hideout, could be all that is needed to trigger something tragic and awful. The very bodies of followers becoming this commodity, paid for a power play. Moving away from this, though, there are also utopian NRMs, groups which seek to strike out and form a new, better way of living, either better in accordance with ancient faith teachings or in a way prescribed as better by the charismatic authority figure. These are your Amish, or in some ways the Panacea Society. They try to live according to the proper order, seeking some idyll like the Garden of Eden, or the way things were. Perhaps a group of fishermen have holed up in the old town, ignoring the industrialization around them. Or perhaps a group in some manor house out in the countryside have taken it upon themselves to form a naturist, barter-based or polygamous society or commune that goes against the established normalcy. Similarly, we have reformist new religious movements. These groups don't necessarily seek to create their own personal utopia, but rather to shape the system they exist within to their ideals. They operate politically, with activism and protest in an effort to move the needle. They can be for social reform, like the Quakers in English society, demonstrate for governmental policies, or act on behalf of nature, the climate, for or against industrialization. But a reformist new religious movement seeks to impose its will on wider structures, go beyond the insular, and create change. Although our modern perception of these groups is largely secularized, that they are activists or political dissidents, historically and even today, many of these organizations hold religious beliefs as central in their movements. Especially in fantasy worlds with immanent active gods, why on earth would faithful folk not get involved in reformist movements? And they make such great complex villains too, due to this added dimension. As much as the Society of Friends does start out as a reformist new religious movement, so too does the Westboro Baptist Church. Make your religions political, because frankly, throughout most of human history, they have been. Speaking of that last group I mentioned, they are also very good examples for the last types of new religious movement. I like to conceptualize these as inward-looking and outward-looking versions of the same thing. Hate groups. These groups identify by who they aren't, who their enemies are. They can be anyone, from political opponents to professions or even species. The difference between inward-looking and outward-looking hate groups is essentially that the former polices its members and its own community to ensure that all objects or people that anger it are rooted out, shunned, expelled, or harmed, while outward-looking groups are mainly engaged in campaigns to enact political reform on a grand scale, often using terror-like tactics. Perhaps a divine squabble between minor deities patronising two different craft guilds spills into the streets, segregating to communities. Or perhaps a certain guild of craftsmen in a dying art form seeks to glorify their work or their deity through revolutionary violent acts, kind of like the Luddites. Hate groups of all kinds using this structure make excellent inflection points to demonstrate society's biggest divisions, and can easily lead to division, unsafe settlements, and violence. some of the biggest motivators in kicking off interesting conflicts in fantasy worlds. Think of all the gangs and thugs that show up in fantasy media. It makes them so much more interesting when their actions are backed up or in the name of some deity, or inspired by some new interpretation of a minor deity's message. Of course, in many cases, hate is justified post facto, but the very fact that such a group may seek to have divine favour, especially if magic is on their side, may give pause or make the situation far more complex. Heck, maybe some unscrupulous creature is the one pulling the strings all along, not to convince the cultists to do evil, but to sully the name of the god they profess their worship to. A holy doctrinal street war between gangs of people venerating the same gods in the same pantheon sounds like the perfect backdrop for some complex fantasy drama to me. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed or been fascinated by this dive into what actually cults or new religious movements are and do, and how we can make them so much more interesting in our games. I can go much deeper into this topic if there's the interest there, so make sure to let me know in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you do want to see more like this. But for now, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.